For today's lesson, we're going to work on slope from a table and an equation. We worked on slope from graphs and ordered pairs last time, so if you'll turn to the same page for slope, we're going to do the other two sections, slope from a table and an equation. To find slope from a table, we're going to find the change in y over the change in x. Just like we did on our graph, we did our rise over our run. When you rise on a graph, it's how your y values change, and when you run on a graph, it's how your x values change. So, underneath that tab, M stands for slope. M is the change in y over the change in x. These two triangles, this triangle here, means change in. It's called a delta sign, so it's change in y over change in x. And it's a ratio, which means there's a division problem. So for our first table, or for our table, we have negative 2 to 4. This value is changing by adding 6. This is plus 6. Negative 2 plus 6 is 4. And then to get from 4 to 8, this is plus 4. To get from 8 to 10 is plus 2. And to get from 10 to 16 is plus 6. So now we've got our change in y values, or our f of x values. Remember, that's another way to write y. In our x values, we have negative 1 to 2. That's adding 3. To get from 2 to 4, we add 2. To get from 4 to 5, we add 1. To get from 5 to 8, we add 3. Now, these don't look like they have a constant change. We're not adding the same amount or subtracting the same amount each time. But when we look at their ratio, because the ratio is the change in y to the change in x, let's look at our first two pairs. From negative 1 to 2, it was plus 3, and from negative 2 to 4, it was plus 6. So our ratio of the change in y values is 6 over 3. The change in y was 6, the change in x was 3. 6 over 3 reduces to 2. Let's look at our second set of ordered pairs, our change in y and change in x. Change in y was 4, change in x was 2. So we would have 4 over 2, the y value goes on top. 4 divided by 2 is 2, so it reduces to 2. Let's look at our next ordered pair. From 4 to 5 and 8 to 10, we had a change in 1 and 2 for x and y. So y values go on top. 2 over 1 reduces to 2. And the last set of ordered pairs, from 510 to 816, our y values went up 6 and our x values went up 3. 6 over 3 is 2. So if there is a constant ratio of the change in y to the change in x, that means this is a line on a graph, and the slope of this line would be 2. So m equals 2 for our slope. There has to be a constant ratio of change in y to change in x. Turning over the next tab for equations, y equals negative 2x plus 5 is on the front of this tab. If you'll turn that tab over, we're going to look underneath it. In an equation in slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b is the equation of the line. This is the equation of any line on a graph. This is called slope-intercept form. M stands for slope. I like to think they use the letter M because it represents the movement on a graph. It represents our rise and run. So slope is the letter M. You'll have a number there in front of x. And then we have B. B is our y-intercept. And I think they use the letter B because this is where we begin on a graph. So y equals mx plus b is slope-intercept form of a graph. We're going to write an example under this tab. And looking at our first example, we're going to find the slope of y equals negative 2x plus 5. Notice that this says y equals. That is how you have to have these to find the slope if it is in slope-intercept form. So for our first one, y equals negative 2x plus 5, our slope is right here in front of the x. The slope is negative 2. Our next one, y equals 1/4 x plus 3. It says y equals, so it's in slope-intercept form. The value for the slope is in front of the x, which is 1/4. So our slope in here is 1/4. And our last one, this is the linear parent function that you learned about in class on Monday, y equals x. Now, I don't see a number in front of x, but we know that if there's not a number there, we can include a 1 because 1 times x is simply x. So y equals 1x. Our slope is the number in front of x when it says y equals, so our slope here is 1. All right, make sure you bring this to class with you tomorrow. If you have any questions, please write them down. And we're going to be working on slope from equations, and we're going to work on slope from tables. Also remember that we have learned to solve for y, so we may tomorrow in class have to solve for y in order to find our slope because it has to say y equals mx plus b.